Well, greetings, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you here. Delighted to see so many friends of the Tanner world, the Tanner educational world here at the university and in our community. I'm Mark Matheson. I'm the director of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, and it's my great honor to introduce my colleague, Professor Erica George, the Samuel Thurman Professor here at our law school. And now doing the important work of the humanities as the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and it's a delight, Erica, to have you in that world. So it's just great to be here. We're so excited to hear from our distinguished guest, Ayad Akhtar. And first, I'm very, very delighted and honored to introduce my esteemed colleague, Professor Erica George, director of the Tanner Humanities Center.
Thank you. Welcome. The University of Utah is on land named for the Ute tribe. This is the traditional unceded ancestral home of the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Goshute, and Ute communities. The official language of the Utah's land acknowledgement is available on our website. The Tanner Humanities Center is named after an educator and an entrepreneur. Obert C. Tanner, a philosopher and founder of the O.C. Tanner Company, and a philanthropist, as well as his wife, Grace A. Tanner. Our center aims to advance humanities exploration and engagement through three core pillars of activity: our academic research, our educational enrichment, and our public engagement and outreach, evenings like tonight. I'd like to take a moment to remember the passing of Carolyn Tanner Irish, who was a visionary leader and an inspiration to our center. We are actually housed in a building that bears her name. She had a lifelong commitment to the humanities, and it is our honor to carry that on. I'd also like to thank the Tanner Humanities staff: Beth James, Associate Director; Jeremy Rosen, the Associate Director for Faculty; Susan Anderson, our Development Officer; Hannah Taub, our Environmental Humanities Fellow; and Kim Coben, our Law Student Fellow, as well as Mariko Sullivan and Amina Mukhtar, our undergraduate interns. I thank the College of Law and the College of Humanities for their support as well. I'd like to acknowledge a few special guests who are here with us this evening. Stephen Tanner Irish is among us, as well as William Johnson, the Program Director of PEN Across America, and Sabrina Adams, the Program Coordinator of PEN Across America. About tonight. The David P. Gardner Lecture in the Humanities and Fine Arts was established here at the University of Utah by the trustees of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values in 1983 at the request of Professor Tanner. It was an annual lectureship to honor his colleague, David Pierpont Gardner. David P. Gardner served as the president of both the University of Utah from 1973 to 1983 and the University of California. He received his degree in political science and history and geography from Brigham Young University and his PhD from University of California at Berkeley. He was a member of the National Academy of Public Administration, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He also chaired the Paul Getty Trust in Los Angeles and served as the president of the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation. He was a trustee of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. To be appointed a Gardner Lecturer is a high recognition of scholarly achievement in the humanities and the fine arts. Our past lectures have been delivered by Nadia Tolokonivka, Stanley Nelson, Susan Laurie Parks, Martha Nussbaum, Anna DeVere Smith, Bobby McFerrin, and Frederick Weissman, among others. Tonight, we recognize and welcome novelist, playwright, and performer Ayad Akhtar. A decade after the attacks of September 11th, he staged a play called Disgraced that captured the paradox of being an American of Muslim descent, and his one-act drama went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. His other plays, including Junk, have been performed at Lincoln Center, on Broadway, received Tony nominations. The Who and the What was performed at Lincoln Center. The Invisible Hand won an Outer Critics Circle John Gassner Award and an Evening Standard nomination. His first novel, American Dervish, was published in over 20 languages, and his most recent novel has been celebrated by the Washington Post as a tour de force and the New York Times as a beautiful novel. The New Yorker has called him an American writer for an age of division. He has never been afraid of provoking his audiences. The Economist on the other side of the pond calls him a bard of American discontent. But his work dwells on questions of belonging. In addition to his Pulitzer Prize for Drama, he's won the Edith Wharton Citation of Merit for Fiction, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And among his other honors, he's been the recipient of the Steinberg Playwriting Award, the Nistroy Award, the Erwin Piscator Award, as well as fellowships from the American Academy in Rome and the Sundance Institute. He's on the board of trustees of the New York Theater Workshop, and he was named the New York State author, succeeding Colson Whitehead, who's been to visit us also, by the New York State Writers Institute. But not only is he a celebrated writer, he is a man committed to service. And on December 2nd, 2020, he became the president of PEN America. PEN is an organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights, and as a human rights lawyer, this is something close to my heart. They're committed to protecting freedom of expression in the United States and beyond. They champion the right to freedom of writing, the right to read, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. PEN, which stands for Poets, Playwrights, Essayists, Editors, and Novelists, was founded 100 years ago in 1922 in New York City. So, with no further ado, I give you Ayad Akhtar. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Erica. It's good to be here. I've been to Utah before, but not to Salt Lake. It's very nice. The 2 hours that I've been here, it's very, very orderly. The view out the window there was remarkable. The mountains and the rain coming through the sunlight. It's a terrific honor to be here, not only because of the distinguished guests that you've had here before, but also because it's the occasion of the opening of a chapter of PEN America here in Salt Lake City. One of the things that we've been wanting to do at PEN in the wake of the political divisions instantiated by the 2016, whatever you want to call it, was to recognize that some of maybe the predominance or the preponderance of cultural production was happening, at least preponderance of cultural production that was gaining attention was happening on the coast, and that there was a need for dialogue and presence in the heartland. And so one of the things that we've wanted to do is to increase the possibility for there to be a kind of interconnectedness with our organization, with local libraries, with communities of writers, so many extraordinary writers across this country, many of whom don't have the same kind of opportunities to become part of the cultural conversation in the way that folks living in New York or Los Angeles do. So it's a terrific honor to be here on the occasion of the opening of this chapter. And you know, as part of that, I'd like to make a few remarks about freedom of expression, which I prepared and I'm going to read to you from on the occasion of this new chapter. These are momentous times. We, as a nation, have perhaps not been so at odds with each other since that fraught and bloody conflict we call our Civil War. And yet, while the conflicts that have engulfed our country, overtaking our communities, may be specific to us and to our history, in their instance itself, as conflict per se, they are not unique to us here in America. The spirit of conflict is something we share with so much of the world today. Globalization and the technology of interconnectedness and communication has increasingly come to mean that we are just part of a larger conflicted conversation, and that larger conversation is part of us. Democracy means many things to many people, a word that in years past has been a catch-all for a way of being we here in this country mostly took for granted. We've somehow associated democracy, if we associate it at all, with justice, but never quite sure exactly how. The great Greek historian Thucydides hints at the connection in his history of the Peloponnesian War when he writes that in human affairs, the question of justice is only relevant where there is equal power to enforce it. For without equal power, the strong will do what they can, and the weak will suffer what they must. Simply put, in a democracy, the will of the strong is not simply borne by the weak. There is, at the very least, a notion, however nominal, however incomplete, of a process, a path to more equal power, a process that does not entail violence, but rather speech, speaking to each other publicly about our needs, our grievances, our national identities, our critiques of the status quo, and also the values we believe are worth conserving. Speaking to one another more or less freely about everything that pertains to our collective life. These are the exchanges that, in a democracy, shape our collective future. A society that wishes to imagine itself capable of responding to the needs of its people, weak and strong, any such society must resist the use of power alone, the embrace of naked power, if you will. The exercise of naked power, the celebration of it, is the logic of the bully. And the rise of autocracy across the planet has brought with it a rise of and jubilation in the public display of bullying, as we see every day in our school board meetings and on our Twitter accounts. This is not a coincidence. These things are all connected. Indeed, naked, unequal power in the business sector we call market share. We celebrate and idolize the destructive success of our wealthiest victors. We are grateful to find ourselves the beneficiaries of their abusive practices. After all, that's how we end up on Amazon or Walmart paying the lowest price. But it isn't just business, small businesses that are bullied. The interests of those in the heartland are bullied by the will of their fellow far wealthier citizens on the coast. And the rise of strong men in power bullying their own nations and those along their borders, as in Ukraine right now, is a recurring dystopian spectacle of naked power whose end is not, I suspect, within view anytime soon. If anything, naked power is in ascendance everywhere. What to do? For some of us, bullying the bully back with whatever means we can muster feels like the only appropriate response. It feels like redress, finally. It can feel like justice. But it isn't justice. It's just a different embrace of unclad, undisguised power. It is not the spirit of exchange, of debate, of critique and commentary, the spirit at the heart of all advance in scientific and human knowledge, which only grows through this sort of exchange, the advance of political equality, which is only arrived at through negotiation and compromise with multiplicity of points of view. This is the process of growth, and it is predicated on speech, on the willingness to inquire, to think freely, and to speak, even when the freedom to do so is threatened. For that is the truth. The exercise of speech that matters to us most, that must matter to us most, that speech which articulates our needs, our understanding, our competing senses of reality, this speech which shapes our lives in cooperation with one another, however tensely, this is what democracy is built on. One more thing. Yes, speaking is at the root of it all, but we cannot only be speakers. We must be those listening too. protecting freedom of expression is not enough. We must be as committed to recognizing and encouraging the act of hearing one another. For without that, speech has no purchase and can have little enduring meaning. So I'm not really here to speak about Penn, but I'll say a few more things. 100 years ago, a group of writers decided that literature could be a force for good, could be a force for cohesion, could be a force for imagining a better world, if you will. Remember the moment, 1922, well, very few of us can actually remember that moment in this room, but we've been taught enough to know that World War I is behind us and World War II is ahead, but the European continent had been through a bloodbath that they had never experienced. And so the group of writers that assembled with the intent to somehow muster the will to imagine enduring peace. Didn't work out so well. But nevertheless, the organization endured. And we have a charter, and I'd like to read a few things off that charter, just a couple of sentences to give you a sense of what it is that PEN stands for. PEN stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought. Members pledge themselves to oppose any form of suppression of freedom of expression in the country and community to which they belong. We stand for a free press. And we believe that literature is a common human currency and something important, even essential to us all. Literature, a common human currency. Well, this is a lecture on the humanities. So I figured, I know they keep showing this book up here. I have no idea how many of you have even bothered to read it. Not that we're all busy. There's no reason why you should have. But I figured if you haven't, and I suspect many of you have not, that it might be good to just give you a feeling for the book before we have any kind of before I make some further remarks, and then maybe we have a conversation. So I'm going to read the opening of Homeland Elegies, which you all have now, thanks to the University of Utah. The opening of this book is an overture, as in the overture at the beginning of an opera, say, which initiates and presents and introduces all of the major melodic themes to come. So everything in the book that eventually emerges happens here first in this overture. The overture is called To America. And you don't have to know anything else because it's the beginning of the book. So, I had a professor in college, Mary Maroney, who taught Melville and Emerson, and who the once famous Norman O. Brown, her mentor, called the finest mind of her generation. A diminutive, cherubic woman in her early 30s, with a resemblance to one of Raphael's angels that was not incidental. Her parents had immigrated from Urbino, Italy. A scholar of staggering erudition who quoted as easily from the Eddas and Hannah Arendt as she did from Moby Dick. A lesbian, which I only mention because she did often. A lecturer whose turns of phrase were sometimes sharp as a German paring knife, could score the brain's gray matter and carve new grooves along which old thoughts would reroute, as on that February morning 2 weeks after Bill Clinton's first inauguration, when, during a class on life under early American capitalism, Mary, clearly interrupted by her own tantalizing thought, looked up from the floor at which she usually gazed as she spoke, looked up and remarked almost offhandedly that America had begun as a colony and that a colony it remained. That is, a place still defined by its plunder, where enrichment was paramount and civil order usually an afterthought. The fatherland, in whose name and for whose benefit the predation continued, was no longer a physical fatherland, but a spiritual one. The American self, long trained to worship its desires, however discreet, however banal, rather than to question them, as the classical tradition taught, ever tumescent American self-regard was the pillaging patria, she said. And the marauding years of the Reagan regime had only expressed this enduring reality of American life with greater clarity and transparency than ever before. Mary had gotten into some trouble the previous semester for similarly bracing remarks about American hegemony in the wake of Desert Storm. A student in the ROTC program taking her class complained to the administration that she was speaking out against the troops. He started a petition and set up a table in the student union. The brouhaha led to an editorial in the campus paper and threats of a protest that never actually materialized. Mary wasn't cowed. After all, this was the early 90s, and the consequences of astringent ideological fire and brimstone or sexual abuse of power while you're at it were hardly what they are today. If anyone had a problem with what she said that afternoon, I didn't hear about it. The truth is, I doubt many of us even understood what she was getting at. I certainly didn't. Worship of desire? Tumescent self-regard? A colony for pillage. In her words was the power of a great negation, a corrective to a tradition of endless American self-congratulation. It was new to me. I was accustomed to the God-blessed, light-of-the-world exceptionalism that informed every hour I'd ever spent in history class. I'd come of age in the era of the hilltop city gleaming for all to see. Such were the glorified tropes I learned at school, which I saw not as tropes, but truth. I saw an American benevolence in Uncle Sam's knowing glare at the post office. Heard an American abundance in the canned laugh tracks on the sitcoms I watched every night with my mother. Felt an American security and strength as I pedaled my 10-speed Schwinn past split-level and two-story homes in the middle-class subdivision where I grew up. Of course, my father was a great fan of America back then. To him, there was no greater place in the world, nowhere you could do more, have more, be more. He couldn't get enough of it. Camping in the Tetons, driving through Death Valley, riding to the top of the Arch in St. Louis before hopping a riverboat down to Louisiana to fish for bass in the bayou. He loved visiting the historic sites. We had framed our photos of trips to Monticello and Saratoga and to the house on Beale Street in Brookline where the Kennedy brothers were born. I recall a Saturday morning in Philadelphia when I was 8 and Father scolding me through a crowded tour of rooms somehow connected to the Constitution. When it was over, we took a cab to the famous steps at the museum and he raced me to the top, letting me win in homage to Rocky Balboa. Love for America and a firm belief in its supremacy, moral and otherwise, was creed in our home, one my mother knew not to challenge, even if she didn't quite share it. Like both Mary's parents, my mother never found in the various bounties of her new country anything like sufficient compensation for the loss of what she'd left behind. I don't think Mother ever felt at home here. She thought Americans materialistic, and couldn't understand what was so holy about the orgy of acquisition they called Christmas. She was put off that everyone always asked where she was from and never seemed bothered they had no idea what she was talking about when she told them. Americans were ignorant not only of geography, but of history too. And most troubling to her was what she thought connected to this disregard of important things, namely the American denial of aging and death. This last irritation would yield a malevolent concretion over the years, a terror-inducing bête noire that saw her to her grave. The thought that growing old here would mean her eventual sequestering and expiration in a home that was nothing like one. My mother's views, however rarely voiced, should have prepared me to understand Mary's dyspeptic take on this country, but they didn't. Not even my Islam prepared me to see what Mary saw, not even after 9/11. I remember a letter from her in the months following that terrifying day in September that changed Muslim lives in this country forever, a 10-page missive in which she encouraged me to take heart, to learn what I could from the trouble ahead, confiding that her struggles as a gay woman in this country, the sense of siege, the unceasing assaults on her quest for wholeness, the roughness of her route to autonomy and authenticity, that all these had been but fires beneath her crucible, provoking creative rage, tempering sentimentality, releasing her from hope in ideology. Use the difficulty, make it your own, was what she said to me. Difficulty had been the flintstone against which her powers of analysis were sharpened, the how and why of what she saw, but which I still wouldn't see truly with my own eyes for 15 years to come, my deepening travails as a Muslim in this country notwithstanding. No, I wouldn't see what Mary saw until I'd been witness to the untimely decline of a generation of colleagues exhausted by the demands of jobs that never paid them enough, drowning in debt to care for children riddled with disorders that couldn't be cured, and the cousins and the best friend from high school who ended up in shelters or on the street, tossed out of houses they could no longer afford, and until the near dozen suicides and overdoses of 40-something childhood classmates in a mere space of 3 years, and the friends and family medicated for despair, anxiety, lack of affect, insomnia, sexual dysfunction, and the premature cancers brought on by the chemical shortcuts for everything from the food moving through our irritable bowels to the lotions applied to our sun-poisoned skins. I wouldn't see it until our private lives had consumed the public space, then been codified, foreclosed, and put up for auction, until the devices that enslave our minds had filled us with the toxic flotsam of a culture no longer even worthy of the name, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself, had become the world's most prized commodity. The very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone, somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had fully mastered the plunder, idealized and legislated the splitting of the spoils, and brought to near completion the wholesale pillage, not only of the so-called colony, how provincial a locution that seems now, but also of the very world itself. In short, I wouldn't see what she saw back then until I'd failed at trying to see it otherwise, until I'd ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption, until the suffering of others aroused in me a starker, clearer cry than any anthem to my longing. I read Whitman first with Mary. I adored him. The green leaves, the dry leaves, the spears of summer grass, the side-curved head ever avid for what came next. My tongue, too, is homegrown. Every atom of this blood, formed of this soil, this air. But these multitudes will not be my own, and these will be no songs of celebration. Thank you. So that's how the book starts. It's a voice addressing its fellow Americans. My mother had passed away. Some of this is in the book. I mean, it's a funny thing because I wrote a book which is, the publisher was very, at least with the hardcover, they were very, very anxious to make sure that the word novel was the biggest thing on the cover. Because the narrator has many of the facts of my life, has my name, and I was writing a story that was risque at times. The father is a famous cardiologist, as my father was, and he, in the first chapter after this overture, is the saga of his treating Donald Trump in the mid-90s. And there was a lot of stuff in the book that made people want to think it was real. And I have done nothing to dispel. I mean, I don't answer those questions. Some of it's real, some of it's not. And I was trying to find a way to channel something that's happened in the culture. Some people have talked about it as a kind of sense of truth decay or a kind of confusing of fact and fiction. I think that what's really happened is that we have been trained to respond to information as if it were narrative information. And we are sold discrete pieces of information for the sake of a business model, if you will. We can talk more about this later. But the larger point being that the metric for interest, driving interest publicly, is no longer truth or whether something's true or not. It's whether it's a good story. So dramaturgy is now actually the dominant category of knowledge. So conflict, promise consequence. Doesn't matter if it's true. And so that was what I wanted to channel in trying to address what had happened to the country. As I said, my mom had passed away, and then as something that the book goes into fairly in depth, alcoholism on the father's. My dad was drinking himself off a cliff basically every day. Trump was our president, and I'd been seeing a picture of the country for some time that I wanted to try to articulate. Chinese have a proverb. Something goes something like this. In a house where the son kills the father, the causes do not lie between the morning and the evening of a single day. And what had happened to the country was not something that had just happened. It wasn't like somebody ran for president and all of a sudden, we're a mess. We'd been a mess for some time. Any student of the Roman Republic and the collapse of the Roman Republic would see the parallels. Been going on for well nigh, I'd say 40, 45 years, that the fundaments of our collective well-being had been dismantled slowly but steadily. I wanted to try to articulate a vision of the country where debt was rampant and where money ruled. I talked earlier about Thucydides, the will of the strong borne by the weak. Seemed to me that increasingly was the country that was this America that my parents, my mom came in 68 and my dad came in 68. They both came over on a program that, in 65, they changed the quotas. Used to be 400 people from the Indian subcontinent, meaning India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, could come over to America a year, 400 people a year. But in 65, they changed that. They lifted the quota. That was because of the Kennedy push to get a man on the moon, science and technology. So State Department started trawling the third world for scientific medical talent. And my parents, who were both top of their class in what was the Pakistani equivalent of Harvard Medical School, came over on a program that gave them visas, plane tickets, jobs, and apartments. Times have changed. The country they came to, so this is not in the book, but for, I don't know, my whole lifetime, certainly, but probably before then, my mom used to complain about a night, my parents' second date in Lahore, when my dad was supposed to show up to take her out to dinner or something, and he didn't show up. And just a year before she's on a couch and she's, in pain and taking pain medication, she's still complaining about this night. Why did you come? I never understood what to say. You love me so much, but you don't even come to And my dad, same old story about this bullshit. And but he answered that question that night. That was this particular time that I remember toward the end of her life. He had had a few to drink, but it was an emotional transparency there that the vodka brought on. He said, don't you understand? It was the night they shot Bobby Kennedy. They killed Kennedy, Bobby. How could I come to a date with you? So my mom said, what the hell does Bobby Kennedy have to do with our second date? Don't you understand? They killed Hope. Hope died. That's what my dad felt about America in the late 60s. It's a very different country than the country he died in. What happened in that 50-year period? That was the question that I wanted to try to answer. How had the country changed and why? Was it always something different than what my parents thought? Did it just take them a half century to come to understand? Or had something fundamentally changed? So what I did was I told the story of their American journeys and their kids and their colleagues who came over at the same time and their kids and what happened to all of us and what that says about what we became or maybe what we always were that we didn't know. Maybe some of you did, but we didn't. Much of my work has been a kind of exploration. Sure, I was born here, but I had parents who didn't really understand this country. My dad was a hugely, hugely successful doctor, one of the most famous cardiologists of his generation. So he understood a lot about cardiology, but he didn't really understand a lot about America. I think he spent most of his life wanting to be American and maybe thought that that's what it meant to be American. But toward the end of his life, I think, came to understand that maybe it was more complicated than all of that. So my parents came here on that program, and I was the firstborn. They were both, my dad was the only son on his side of the family. My mom was the eldest child on her side of the family. They were both the first to leave Pakistan. They came to America. I was the first child to be born on either side of the family, and I was the first born in America, outside of the country. So it was, suffice to say, it was a lot of expectation on me. And my mom, by the time I was 5, had taught me to answer the question of what I wanted to do when I grew up by saying, I want to be a neurologist. I didn't really know what a neurologist was, but I said it anyway. Remember one parent of one of my friends said, oh, you should spend more time with him, telling her son. He knows what he wants to be when he grows up. So I repeated ad nauseum that I wanted to be a neurologist, even once I knew what it meant and I was a little bit older, until I was I was a junior in high school. And a remarkable sort of confluence of, one could call it a synchronicity, or I don't know what you want to call it, but there's someone here tonight who was, how would you describe it exactly? You were a student teacher, and your supervisor was a teacher named Diane Derfler. Diane Derfler changed my life. I was going to talk about Diane Derfler anyway. I always talk about Diane Derfler. I've talked about her in the press. Funny little anecdote, when I had the bizarre, shocking sort of twisted events in my life where I won a Pulitzer Prize, got this call out of nowhere. And my mom could not, my mom was like, drop mic, life's been hard, but my son won a Pulitzer Prize. A bunch of papers in Milwaukee wrote about it, but the local paper in Brookfield and Elm Grove, circulation 15, I guess, had not written about this yet. So my mom puts on a fake British accent and hides her number with the star 82 or star 6. I don't know what you have to do to hide your number. And calls Elm Grove Leaves and says, it's disgraceful that you have a writer from this community who won the Pulitzer Prize and you don't write an article about it. Who are you, ma'am? Hang up. And she calls me and tells me, if you get a call from somebody at the Elm Grove Leaves, I'm the one who called, but don't tell your father that I did this. So sure enough, I get a call from the editor of Elm Grove Leaves, Scott something or other, very nice fellow, who says, we heard you won a price, not a prize, but a price. Would you be willing to talk to one of our journalists? Meaning not him, he's the editor, so he's not going to talk to me. So I said, sure, I'd be happy to talk to anybody. So finally I get this call and do this interview. And I spent the whole time talking about Diane Durfler because I figured there were going to be, I've spoken about her in other instances, but I figured there'd be people in that community who probably had her. And so they went and found her to get a quote from her. And she said something very, very sweet, very nice about me. She was, just to paint the portrait here, by the time I'd met Miss Durfler, she'd been through 5 husbands. And she lived on 40 acres of land north of where we were in an area called Germantown, Kettle Moraine, where she tended a farm-sized garden every morning and walked her 10 Great Danes before she came into school. Kids did not talk in her class. We did not pass notes. And it wasn't because she told us not to. It was because you just didn't do that with Miss Durfler. I remember before having Miss Durfler, the first day that I was going to have her, the first day of school, my junior year, I was in homeroom and one of the football players asked me, what have I got third period? We're going through our schedules together. What do you got third period? I was like, I got World Lit with Miss Durfler. He's like, dude, she is going to rock your world. That's what she did. She changed so many kids' lives. So I had Miss Durfler, and she assigned this story by Friedrich Dürrenmatt called The Tunnel. It was the first day, first assignment. So I go and I read this story, short story, that night, and a story about a guy who wakes up on a train. He doesn't know how he got there. He's trying to figure out where the train's going. He's confused. He talks to some people in one car. They don't know what the hell's going on. Some of them don't even seem to know they're on a train. Something goes and finds somebody who seems to be aware that there is a train, this is a train and it's going somewhere, but he doesn't know where. But maybe that guy knows. So he keeps asking people. Finally gets to the conductor. Conductor says, look, I just work here. If you want to figure out something about what's happening with this train, you probably go talk to the guy who's driving the train. So he gets to the front, the locomotive, and he sees this engineer furiously shoveling coal into the furnace like a madman. And the narrator's starting to get a little freaked out. He says, where is this train going? And the engineer just looks at him and points at the ladder. And so the narrator walks up the ladder and looks out and sees that the train is falling into this abyss, this tunnel. That's the story. What the hell kind of story is this? This is what I'm reading, this story. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So show up at class the next day, and Miss Durfler walks in. She's got her hands in her pockets and, playing with her change in her front pocket. So what was the meaning of the story you read last night is what she asks to a understandably entirely perplexed group of high school juniors and seniors. Silence. Nobody's willing to hazard a guess. And finally, Miss Durfler starts to speak. She says, the train is life. Every now and then, one of us wakes up to the question of where it's going, where it might have started, where it's headed, what it is. The one who would seek to know tends to ask those around him or her. Most don't seem to be aware there's even a question to be asked. Every now and then, somebody will point the way to someone else, and he or she who wishes to know the truth will eventually face the reality that life is a great unknown, which when we confront fully occasions a kind of mortal terror, which is, of course, how the end of the story was, this terrified moment. Something happened to me in that moment. Edward Said talks about it as the opening up of the metaphorical dimension, the dimension of reality in which reflection and contemplation suddenly become an active force. They're not something that can almost seem more real than reality. There was something about that moment in which she interpreted this story for me as a 15-year-old. It was evident in that moment, I kid you not, I am not making this up for a humanities lecture. I knew at that moment what I was going to do with my life. I have never questioned for a moment from that moment forward. I fell in love so deeply. I had an experience of reality so profound, so decisive, so self-evident that it was clear to me being committed to understanding through story was what I would give my life for, too. I've been through lots and lots and lots of hardship. I mean, Erica was so kind to read an introduction that had, nothing but successes. The more appropriate introduction would be the one that listed all of my failures, of which there have been so many. I've learned from failure. Failure is the thing that I worry that now that I've been more successful, I won't have enough failure. Because that's the only thing that's taught me anything. Success has not taught me anything. Failure is what teaches me, what makes me better. But through all of the difficulty of a career that, I started wanting to write at 15, and wasn't until 39 that I published my first book. It's 24 years. A lot of failure, a lot of, what the hell are you doing with your life, for God's sake? My grandfather in Pakistan is 26 years old and pulls me into the room and says, "What is wrong with you? You're so smart. You're so intelligent. Why are you doing this nonsense? What happened to you?" What happened to me was Miss Dörfler. What happened to me, actually, and there's a bit of a plug here, but what happened to me was the humanities. The conversation about higher education these days is pathetic, frankly. The notion that somehow education exists that the sole reason for education and the soul is somehow this economic model is so myopic. And anybody who has a real net worth understands that. You talk to folks at Google or you talk to folks at any of the sort of cutting edge corporate concerns. They're not looking for robots trained in STEM. They're not. That's just a fact. It's not a plug anymore. We live in an endlessly complex world where specialization has led to a narrowing of the capacity for us to understand reality. Almost nobody is synthesizing anymore. There is no professional synthesizer. The humanities are really the last place where there can be an inquiry into reality that is multi and interdisciplinary in the truest sense of the word. I didn't say to my grandfather, "The humanities happened to me, Grandpa." I just sort of respectfully kept quiet and said, I think it'll work out. So anyway, thank you. I think we're going to have some questions and.
Turn them on. Hello? Oh,
Hello. Yes.
great. Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Yeah, there was a lot of success in this life and career, and I did talk about all the wonderful things you've done. And I was struck by you sharing that the first novel to be published took 24 years,
Yeah.
that this has been a journey.
I wrote two before that. They were awful. They were so bad. I often joke, I've had 4 stages in my writing career. My first stage, and each of these stages lasted years, not just like months, years. The first stage, I'm writing horribly, and I think I'm writing really well. The second stage, I'm still writing really badly, but I'm starting to figure out and try to get better. The third stage, I'm writing better, but nobody's paying any attention. Years, like 8 years, each of these 10 years. Last stage, I'm writing better and folks are paying attention. That's this current stage. Hopefully not to be followed by, I think I'm writing really well, but I'm writing really poorly.
So we are going to open for questions from the audience. We are using the Slido app for those of you who'd like to ask electronically. There are also 2 microphones here at the front of the room for audience questions.
Sorry, you were about to ask me a question and I just,
Well,
bull rushed the
it
question.
was a comment. So I did a little research on you, which is how I came up with that introduction. And the New York Times says that your book, the first book, was self-assured and effortlessly told. And you were telling us that.
well, that
happened
was
over time.
the third book that I
phase.
wrote,
Okay.
but the first that I got published.
Okay. All right. Great.
Yeah.
So you talked about a high school teacher who really made a difference in your life. I noticed that you went to Brown where you majored in theater and religion, and you also acted and directed in student plays. I wanted to ask you about studying the liberal arts in college. And really, you wrote your plays before your novels. So I was wanting to invite you to talk more about how that writing is different. What is the work that theater does in a way that a novel perhaps does not? I mean, both of them are storytelling, but why do you think you started with plays first?
I'm going to answer your question in an indirect way, if that's okay.
All right. That's great.
I have been a deep believer in knowledge as a force. I don't think knowledge is purely academic. I think knowledge moves reality. I got interested in acting. I had a similar experience as I did with Diane Durfler, but not with a particular person. It was just the first time I had a friend who had asked me to audition for a play. He thought I'd be good. I was a little bit like the character in the play, this arrogant kid or whatever. So I auditioned and he put me in the play, and I had an experience acting, which was the first time I was paying attention to my inner life in this way that an actor has to, if they're going to be any good. And I started to see that the more I knew about myself and my emotional reactions or my anger, my fear, the more I understood about myself, the more I could do as an actor. The more I understood about myself, the more deeply I could see into the play that I was reading or working on and the other work that I was interested in. The process of acting was had nothing to do with wanting to be seen or getting applause or anything like that. It was about inquiry into my own emotional makeup. Understanding self-knowledge, if you will. This is where I come back to this idea of knowledge as a force, something that shapes reality. Choice. I understood choice better by understanding myself better. Acting is what led to that, and humanities for me in general are a way of approaching the human experience that's consistent with what I'm suggesting. So plays, I always knew I was going to write a play. I studied theater in college because of this experience I had with this friend of mine who directed this play, and I suddenly got acting, and then acting led to psychoanalysis. I worked my way through half the collected works of Freud my second year in college. I worked my way through Lacan, Winnicott, and Jung by the end of college. This interplay between understanding the inner life, the dream life, acting, emotional awareness, the ability to do something on stage that had emotional impact, the ability to read more deeply, whether it's Shakespeare or any number of other writers, all of those things were intertwined. And so theater was, in a lot of ways, the vehicle for me to find my way there.
Right. And on way there and places you've been, places your family has been, communities to which you belong, your writing has been celebrated, but it's also met with some critique in some quarters. Emotional inner life and representation. I imagine some of that has to hurt.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. But
do you want me to provide context?
sure, yeah. Okay, so this isn't really and I'm a lawyer too. This is not even a question. It's like directly leading the witness, but yes.
Were you leading the witness to the context, or did you have something further that you wanted to?
Context, please.
Okay. Yeah, Czesław Miłosz, the great Polish poet, once said something that then Philip Roth gets credited for, because Philip Roth said it a lot in lots of public circumstances. He said, when a writer is born into a family, that family is finished. And Philip Roth used to quote Miłosz, basically saying, that's why I write the way that I write. That's why I have so many Jews who hate me. When Roth published Portnoy's Complaint, there was such an outcry amongst the Jewish American community, which was only a couple of decades from Hitler's final solution. And American Jews had legitimate reason to be concerned about what their fates would be in this country at that time. And here you've got this young writer who comes along and is painting them in this really odd, lascivious sort of way that is easy for non-Jewish Americans to make fun of and all of that sort of stuff. And, Philip Roth's mom gets calls saying, your son is an anti-Semite. So she calls Philip Roth and says, I'm hearing you're an anti-Semite, Philip. Are you an anti-Semite? He says, no, Mom, I'm Jewish. I'm not an anti-Semite. He's like, okay, that's nice to hear. But the point being that communities that have concern about the instability of their belonging in the American project have understandable fears around how they are represented. That's not my problem. That may be the problem of some of my characters, but it's not my problem. Because when a writer is born into a family, or when a writer is born into a community, that community is finished. That's what a writer's got to do to tell the truth, no matter how it makes somebody look. We are not advertisers or ad guys. We're not PR specialists. I sometimes worry that we're in an era where art is increasingly seen for its social utility. Art isn't helpful or useful in that way. You want to move hearts and minds? Buy a Super Bowl commercial.
On commercialism, a good amount of your writing does take off the theme of your college professor. What is it to be the colony of pillage? What is it to privilege and worship wealth? I was surprised to read Homeland Elegies and actually see some discourse on antitrust law.
Absolutely, it's an important subject.
It is indeed. It's about concentrations of power, right? That's ultimately what that body of law is about. But this novel, Homeland Elegies, the more recent novel, interrogates who we give power to, who assumes power, what we value. And could you, well, I guess reading your intro took us through some of why you're working in that way.
Yeah, but I'm happy to talk more about it. I mean, I think that one of the great untold stories is finance, the rise of finance. And in particular, the rise of debt financing. Really in many ways, we're seeing this moment now 40 years after what happened, in the early 80s when Paul Volcker let interest rates rise so high that in order to bring down inflation, we're seeing another moment where folks are starting to talk about that again. It's a really fundamental moment in American history, actually, because what it did was it reshaped the incentives around money, and it led to the sort of explosion of debt. And I don't mean explosion of debt like, oh, it's really bad to have debt. That's not what I mean. I mean debt as a tool. And, in our reception earlier, I was hearing that the legislature had increased tuition 4.8%. And there was some musing about, well, why that number? And my surmise is it probably tracks debt payments that the university is making on its debt. As of 4 years ago, American universities owed $2.3 trillion in debt. I'm not talking about student debt. I'm talking about universities taking out debt to build buildings, to attract faculty, to pay for athletic programs. What is this arms race of increasing tuition to pay down debt, to increase cash flow, to take out more money, to build bigger buildings, to have more faculty, to have better sports programs, to increase tuition, to take out more debt? What is this model? I have a friend at MIT who's on the steering committee, and he said, what, are we trying to become Rhode Island? It's the growth model. The growth model has, like a cancer, taken over every aspect of absolutely everyone's life. What is the material mechanism by which the growth model does this? 4% return. The 4 to 5% return has become the bedrock of social policy, a national policy around the world. Finance is the great untold story of our time because it's actually what's shaping our lives. None of this other stuff that we think is shaping our lives is actually having the effect that finance is. And let me just put a button on this, close this little thought out, which is in the classroom, increasingly we are in a situation as pedagogues of customer service. The student is the customer. We are providing a service. How did higher education become a customer service business? And we are wondering about the culture wars? It's about finance. It's about where the money's coming from and how it's got to get paid down. We need another 4.8% increase of tuition to pay down the debt.
I'm going to switch gears. I don't even have a transition. I'm going to go back to writing, and I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have come in. Here's one from Albors. Have you ever met with any challenges where your publishers wanted to censor the politics of your writing? And what advice would you give to new writers, particularly those of Middle Eastern, North African descent, who might face challenges with publishers?
Thank you for that. I have been fortunate to not face that matter. But I came of age and established something of a career, if we could call it that, before the era of the sensitivity reader. Today, I would not have a career. My work would be subjected to sensitivity readers at the major publishing houses, and folks would find my work objectionable because it doesn't represent people in an unambiguously positive light. Underprivileged, or let's say underrepresented communities. that's the only experience I anticipate having with a publisher. I'm sure there are others, and you might be wondering about a different kind. I have, of course, and I'm dealing with this right now on TV. I have a big TV project that looks like it's not going to go forward because of the politics. Because TV is not something that we still have not, we still can't say a lot of stuff on TV. People could lose their jobs. And 20 years after 9/11, there's still so little meaningful engagement with the history that led to 9/11. The American public, God bless them, I say this with compassion, still pretends that like 9/11 was this act of interstellar evil that visited itself upon our shores ex nihilo. And good Lord, how unjust. The ahistoricism of our approach and relationship to 9/11 is frankly pathetic. And I'm not even speaking forcefully about it, because there is a forceful case to be made that that ignorance is part of exactly the problem. But you couldn't say, I mean, I said some of this with a little bit nicer tone to the guy who is taking over for Terry Gross on Fresh Air. There's a chapter in the book that deals with the history of the Afghani war and the sort of CIA, and I can't remember his name is Dave something. Dave Davies, yeah. Dave Davies. I talked a little bit about this with Dave Davies, and he interrupts me at one point. He says, so for our viewers, just need to clarify that you're not condoning mass murder. I'm trying to have a conversation about history, but flirting anywhere near the wound of 9/11, you can't do it.
So this just came in. Justin is interested in January 6th. January 6th was a Rubicon.
I don't think I'm the guy to talk to. I think I could maybe suggest some people, but
but the okay. Well, but the question is January 6th, and I do think 9/11. You were just talking about ahistoricism. January 6th didn't just happen January 6th. If we take seriously, I think all of your writing. So the question is there a path back from that culture?
No.
Oh.
Absolutely not.
Really?
The platforms have incentivized. We are being turned into lab rats. Yuval Hariri has already talked about the human system has been hacked, and we are willing participants in the hacking. Social media, the devices, the technology that is offloading so much of our cognitive function to computers. It comes at a cost, people. It's not like it's just somebody's making a lot of money off of this. And the incentives that are now driving discourse and that are driving, as I said earlier, dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is what's driving attention. Increasingly, the bloodier the story, the more it captivates the attention of he or she or they who is on the device. I don't see us coming back from that until we are really seriously willing to think deeply about artificial intelligence. The incentives are too obvious for monetary gain to big tech. It's not even like I'm not even saying it's bad. I'm just saying it is what it is.
In part because I think we haven't questioned it sufficiently. I don't know if you were done finishing that.
I mean, I'm never done, and I probably always should be done. So.
No. Actually, earlier this year, our Tanner lecture on human values was Professor Shoshana Zuboff, and she's the author of Surveillance Capitalism and the Right to a Human Future. And
Yeah, but the right to a human future is a pretty term. Who's willing to do anything about it? You got to get off your phone to do something. Somehow this instance of self-promotion is seen as some kind of like civic act of the incentives are so inverted. There's something about the performance of the self that is, it's overtaken civic life. It's overtaken our national being. So in a weird way, one could hope for things like January 6th to wake us up, because we're not going to wake up otherwise.
Thank you. Here's another question from the audience. This one's fun.
Okay.
Can you talk about your best failure? What was would you fail,
Oh my God.
like epic fail to date? What is the event that taught you the most about yourself and propelled you forward?
I don't know if I could talk about the
Oh, okay.
best failure. It's hard. I don't know all of you very well.
And the question's anonymous.
I'd written 2 novels. And then I wrote a third. I had a day job. I was writing in the mornings and in the evenings. I was living paycheck to paycheck. I was insolvent. It was in my late 30s. I had married early, and my difficulties had resulted in, the end of that relationship. I had no prospects. I had no agent. I had no property. Most of my cohorts from Brown who had graduated with me, were doing very well, and many of them had multi-million-dollar apartments on Central Park West. My parents had increasingly stopped asking what I was going to do with myself. I was getting to the point where I didn't have any skills to do anything else. I just kept doubling down. I just kept thinking I was going to somehow make it work. I kept remembering Kim Basinger winning the Oscar and saying, if it can happen to a girl from Georgia, I'm not a girl from Georgia. I wrote this third novel after trying to ply my trade as a writer in film. I wrote all these scripts. None of the films got made, and often didn't get paid for the work I did. It was hard. I wrote a book that I thought was good. Thought I'd learned a lot. I'd learned a lot about how to tell a story well. I thought the hardship had kind of opened me up and made me less pretentious, if you think I'm pretentious now. I had a lawyer who believed in me, who had some wonderful clients. He was kind of like an old school talent scout. But he couldn't do anything by himself. All he could do was keep encouraging me. And as I was writing this third novel, he called me every week. How's the novel going? How's the novel? So I finally finished it. He read it. He loved it. He had all these agents that he knew. Sent it to one. It's good. How am I going to take it on? Sent it to another, and another, and another, and another. 7 agents, all passed. Some of them said, it's good, I like it, but I just don't have a passion for it. I don't see it in the marketplace. I don't think anybody's going to want to read this. I don't see how I can sell it. I have to be a champion for this, and I have to really, in order to be able to. So he didn't have anybody else to show it to. I had a friend who knew really, really powerful, important agent in New York City, will remain nameless. And he said, let me talk to him about your book. I loved it. This my friend had read it, and he loved it. So he reaches out to this agent. I get an email in 5 minutes. I heard from Oren, you have this book. I respect Oren so much. Please send it to me. I will read it right away. I'm so excited. I don't know why I just got so excited. I was like, oh, maybe I had to wait for this guy. 2 weeks pass, 3 weeks pass. Finally get an email, long email, about how wonderful the book is. But he's not going to take it on. He doesn't feel that he can sell it. I went home that night, and I can't describe it any other way. Every single nerve ending in my body was in pain. I had never experienced anything like it. Every part of my body was in psychic pain. I lay down on the bed, and I thought, this is it. Like, this is the moment. You got to give up. And I had a thought which I should not be sharing with you, but I am going to do it anyway because you asked me. And because I'm imprudent. I thought, if this is what it takes to come back the next time and be able to do it, then I'll go down with the ship. I'm not going to give up. 3 months later, that book was the biggest sale of debut fiction in New York City in the year of 2010. 2 weeks later, I found an agent randomly who loved the book so much, she said, I've been waiting 15 years for this book. Somehow she got an ungodly amount of money that enabled me to write for 4 or 5 years without having to worry about money. Which led to writing all these plays and it was the foundation of the entire next chapter, the possibility of a career. 2010, this happened. 2013, I won the Pulitzer Prize. How the hell do you go from that to that? Kim Basinger was right. I am a girl from Georgia. And what I learned in that moment, which I will never forget, it is the quality of the choice you make. Sometimes in the most difficult moment that actually defines your course. I know there is a connection between that internal choice and the encounter that led to that next agent and whatever else happened. I know that. I can't prove it to you, but I just know it. It's not a belief, it's a knowing. It was a test, if you will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions that follow up that I'm going to try to combine. One is from a friend of mine I haven't seen, William Nee, who used to be Amnesty International in Hong Kong, also a friend of freedom of expression, and the co-director of PEN Utah, Paisley Rechtel, who is here in the audience. So tonight launches PEN Utah. Thank you for being here. Paisley's question. What does the future of humanities actually have? What future does the humanities have in the age of social media and AI? Can great literature withstand the pressures of capital, Twitter, and the algorithms? And if so, William's question is also about big tech. If we need as a nation to speak freely and importantly, listen to each other, given the information silos powered by big tech, algorithms that self-select, on a very practical level, how can we carry out the conversation? Do you see those connections between them?
Thank you for this evening. Those are big questions.
Okay.
Oh my God. Way above my pay grade. So yes, I do. I do see the through line in those questions. And I think those are really pivotal, important questions for which, of course, I have no meaningful or actionable answers. I mean, I do think on the sort of big tech front that antitrust law in this country has been woefully incapable of dealing with the evolving landscape of threats to our national economic life. The metric the sort of post-Borkian legacy of good to the consumer. If it's good for the consumer, then market share is okay, has led to a truly, truly nightmarish scenario in which we have a handful of people who control our consciousness. How do we walk that back? I don't know that it's going to be easy to walk it back. But I think if we have a generation of young antitrust thinkers, if we have another Robert Bork who can somehow move the conversation in a different direction, that perhaps we can find a collective will to recognize that having your toilet paper delivered to your house in 2 hours is not a national common good. It seems hard to say that and recognize that might happen. And that's how extraordinary the situation we are in now. That because we want our toilet paper in 2 hours, this is what we have to live through. So that's the big tech front. There's discussion, there's a more in-depth discussion about Section 230, about whether platforms can or should be held responsible for speech on their. There is an interesting case to be made that yes, they should be, and because the algorithm, in its own sense, it's not like it's something I mentioned to Eric on the phone. It isn't really a freedom of speech issue anymore. It's really about reach. It's about the freedom to monetize speech that is ultimately destructive and poisonous, toxic, and somehow that is being placed in the same bucket as a single act of free speech. But it's not a single act of free speech. It's an act of speech which is then transformed by the choice of the platform to promote it to a gazillion people. It is not the marketplace of ideas in the traditional sense of the word. Jurisprudence around freedom of expression has generally revolved around the idea that if you say something and I say something, well, we're all free to figure out what the better idea is. Not anymore. Now we are being force-fed the most lucrative idea to the platform. The best idea is no longer a criteria, so marketplace of speech is not a meaningful category for jurisprudence anymore either. As far as the humanities in the era of AI, I worry, of course. But I don't just worry about the humanities in the era of AI. I worry about the human in the era of AI. Artificial intelligence and climate change are going to be the questions of the next 50 to 100 years. And perhaps artificial intelligence a more significant one than climate change. And I don't think we're anywhere near understanding the implications.
Yeah. Another one of our speakers we had was, there's a, hi, I'm so excited to have a live question. Hello.
I'm Erin Perkins. I'm a 1L here at the U. And
Hello. I got the 2 L's this year, so I haven't seen you yet. Hey.
Nice speaking with you. So I have a question from the beginning of your presentation. When you described your teacher and then it took you 15 years to really understand what she was saying, I was wondering, for marginalized groups to express their humanity and try to get the other side to get what they're saying, what are your thoughts on bridging that 15-year gap and making it shorter so that it doesn't take you to experience to understand it?
Thank you for that. I'm a big believer in process. I'm a big believer in suffering. I'm a big believer in deep time. I'm a big believer that understanding that is worth having doesn't come easily. So my simple answer to that question is that 15-year gap is right. I don't want it to be quicker. when I know, I want that knowing to have the richness of life. I don't want the meaning to be a sentence. I think becoming an artist is a foolish thing to do. But if you're so foolish as to think that that's what you must do with your life, you won't be talked out of it. And I think that there is a kind of divine foolishness that it can lead to, in which there is a union with reality, a oneness with the reader. Art at its best is about absorption into another order of being. It's not about what somebody else thinks of me.
Thank you.
My follow-up to that is,
Student.
so if it's, I understand you're saying it's about your own understanding of yourself, but I'm talking in the context of the marginalized people. Are they supposed to wait that 15, 20, 30 years for others to get on board?
Can I add a question that's also come
Yes.
from here? Because there's another question that's quite similar to that. And it's about Penn as well. Well, now it seems to not be here. Where is it? The gist of the question was, yes. Oh, boy. Did these disappear after a minute? Someone was asking about how Penn, yes, can you discuss how Penn balances the ideals of freedom of expression and with the issues you described about our current social media discourse, where there are expressions that are expressed poorly or perhaps target marginalized groups?
I mean, when we're talking about art, when I'm talking about social media, I'm talking about art, which is a process. It's not that there can't be art on social media, but I'm speaking about the gap in understanding that I was talking about in my excerpt at the top of the lecture. I'm not speaking about my own understanding of myself when I talk about knowledge hard won. Until, as I said from my talk, I wanted to be a writer when I was 15, and then took a long time, and there were a lot of things along the way. And one of the big moments for me was when I was 32. And I had a realization. Up until that point, I thought being an artist and wanting to write was about expressing myself. And then something changed in me. And I understood that I didn't have anything to express. I was looking at the world and I was assuming that I understood everything I saw. And that if I could just find the words to describe what I thought and felt, that was the job. And something changed when I was 32 and I realized, I don't know anything. I thought that when I looked at those people or that thing, or when I saw this, that I thought I knew what I was seeing, but then I realized, no, I don't. And actually, it's much more creative to not know and to ask the question, what's happening? It's what Flannery O'Connor means when she says, I'm a writer because I can't figure out what a doorknob is for. At 32, I suddenly realized that writing was not about expressing myself. It was about creative engagement with reality, with the world, with something outside myself that I didn't understand and that I was going to try to inquire and give shape to and show love and death and murder and greed. Because I was going to try to understand those things. That's the understanding I'm talking about, not an understanding of myself. I know that it is not responding directly to your question, But that's my answer, because that's the process. What other people do with it is not up to me. What other people understand or don't understand is also not up to me. I don't have that control. And accepting that situation is what it means for me to be an artist.
Thank you. Another question here.
Thank you very much. This is Loic Chibechu from Goldman Sachs, speaking of finance. So one of the things that I did prior of coming here today is I listened to a lot of your interviews, and one of my favorite quotes was that wealth is at the center of the American dream. Now, speaking as an immigrant and someone that knows a bit about finance and wealth, my question to you is, how were you able to withstand social pressure, family pressure, especially coming from an immigrant family around all these years, knowing that wealth is at the center of the American dream? Thank you.
A fine question for somebody from Goldman Sachs to be asking. I have a feeling that your colleagues at Goldman Sachs would be proud of you. Goldman is a really fascinating firm. The history of Goldman, for those of you who don't know it, is a remarkable history. And in many ways, one of the things that Goldman has been able to do, I mean, there's a reason why so many of our Treasury secretaries have been from Goldman. Because there's something in the culture of Goldman which is about understanding the intersection of economics and service. And of course, you got to make some money. In fact, the more money you make, the more power you have to shape the world. So those big mahers from Goldman have helped to shape the world for many generations now. And there's a reason for it that's not just about trying to rig the system. You know, it's a great question, and I don't really have a simple answer for it other than, you know, my mom would be very frustrated with me. My brother, who's younger than me, would read Entertainment Weekly and was fascinated with the weekly grosses when he was like 13. Wow. And he wrote a paper in class predicting the weekend gross for the upcoming release of an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie called Total Recall. That was his paper. Very smart guy. And I remember I was, older than him, and I was saying to our mom, I was like, what is this? He's writing a paper about an upcoming gross of a box office? And she was saying, he's going to make money and you're not. I just somehow, I got a hit of I got a main line into that part of my brain that probably would have, I don't know if it's maybe the same part that when you fall in love or when you do a certain kind of opiate or whatever, it just went off. And it just left everything else in the dust. Of course, as I've gotten older, I've recognized the importance of having some money. But for most of my life, I haven't, So it doesn't really answer your question, but thank you.
All right, this will be a question that you can answer, and this will be my last question from the audience. What are you currently reading right now? What do you recommend we read? Not your own book. Okay. Which we are going to read.
Yes, I wouldn't recommend myself anyway.
Oh.
I
recommend your stuff.
What am I reading? I mean, I read so many things at the same time. So I just bought the Ray Dalio book. And I think the new one about, the collapse of nations and all of that sort of stuff. Ray Dalio he runs Bridgewater Capital, is, very, very famous money person, and has written interestingly about the debt cycle, actually, fascinatingly, is tracking what's really happening. The rise of cryptocurrency really is something that reading Dalio really helps you to understand why that's happening. So I'm going to read the new Ray Dalio, and then, nod out to a couple Shakespeare scholars here in the room who have the best lives of all of us. you just don't know it. To be able to spend a lifetime reading Shakespeare is probably the great thing that you could do with yourself, for yourself. So I'm always reading Shakespeare. So I'd say Shakespeare.
Wonderful. On that note, please join me in thanking Ayad Akhtar. And if you are interested in learning more about Penn America, Penn Utah, there is material outside. Please follow the Tanner Humanities Center. We'll have a smaller conversation over at Tanner Humanities Center tomorrow about Penn Utah chapter, and be in touch with us to learn more about that. Thank you. Yeah, and here's a book. Thank you. Thanks so much.